Hello, my name is Sydney Ozerski, and this is my Vivarium care plan for juvenile corn snake Pantherophis guttatus. So for the enclosure, I went with a 40-gallon breeder because juvenile corn snakes at about 6 months of age are going to be around 20 to 30 inches, and a 40-gallon breeder, the length is 36 inches, so this gives them plenty of space to be able to stretch out completely. They also have 18 inches width and 16 inches of height, and this allows for the corn snake to have plenty of space to roam and explore throughout the enclosure. So for lighting, I went with a 50-watt deep heat projector by Arcadia, and I chose to go with this heat source because it actually doesn't produce any light, and this allows for it to be used 24 hours a day. And with this heat source, I'm going to actually pair it with a herpstat, and by doing this, we can actually replicate the natural temperature cycles that happen throughout a 24-hour period. Additionally, I will be using a UV, specifically a T5 6% UVV bulb from Arcadia, and this will be given for a 12-hour cycle to replicate daylight outside. Corn snakes, if they are outside, they will be exposed to UVB, and it may not be at high levels like desert species, so the percentage is actually lower for a forest species because you don't want to give them too much UVB, and that can result in damage to the snake. So for my background, I first went in with spray foam and covered 3 of the 4 walls of my enclosure. And when the foam was still wet, I then went and added a cork round and a few cork flats to the background. And I also added pots so that later I could go and plant plants into my background. Once that foam had dried, I went through with a knife and carved out the foam to give it a very naturalistic look. Once that was done, I then went through and added silicone to the entire foam, and before that was able to set, I added cocoa fiber onto it. That's what you see here in this picture with all of the brown background. That's from the cocoa powder or cocoa fiber. I also added silicone and cocoa fibers to my cork, and that was to try and give it more of a naturalistic look. So as you can see here, this is the final look of the background. So I also went through and added plants. So this right here is a spider plant. I use this because it gives good cover, but it's also an indoor plant that's easy to maintain, and it also really looks good in the enclosure. And so I also had added the cork bark because that allows for extra hiding spots and just some more interesting elements to the enclosure. So the cork round actually in the middle of the photo, you can see that's completely hollow, so the snake can go through that to kind of allow them an extra hiding spot. And finally, I also added moss to the background just to give it a little bit more of a naturalistic look. So for my substrate, I first went in and added a drainage layer. So here you can see I have a layer of clay balls, which was going to act as my drainage layer. So if I was to get the enclosure overly wet, water would go down through the substrate and into the drainage layer and actually hold that excess water. And this water then can be evaporated and then increase the humidity within the enclosure. The next layer to my substrate is a mesh screen, and this mesh screen allows for the drainage layer and the substrate on top to be separated so that they don't mix. And then my substrate layer right here is composed of 30% organic topsoil, 20% play sand, 20% cocoa fiber, and 30% cypress mulch. So I went with this because it gave a very dirt-like look, but it was also easy for snakes to be able to burrow through, and it also will hold a little bit of humidity throughout the enclosure. And finally, I added a layer of leaves just to add extra hiding areas for the snake, and it also gives a really fun look to the enclosure. So for my plants and furniture, I first added a rock water bowl. So I used a rock water bowl because it looks very naturalistic. I didn't want to use anything that was glass or ceramic because it just doesn't look as natural as this rock bowl does. And next I added in wooden hides. So I have two wooden hides. One is on the warm side of the enclosure, one is on the cool side of the enclosure. So this allows for the snake to choose where it wants to hide, if it does want to hide, but also the wood looks very naturalistic, kind of going with the natural theme of the enclosure. I also added some other plants. So right here you can see I added a pothos plant, and I chose that because those plants are very easy to grow indoors and they can grow very large and provide lots of cover. I also chose a snake plant because they also provide lots of cover. They're an indoor plant, and they're really fun to add to the enclosure. I did plant all of my plants in the soil. I kept them in a mesh pot. That way I was trying to avoid having the snake be able to actually dig up the roots. Hopefully that'll help to keep them in place longer without the snake digging in, uprooting the plants. So next I provided some sticks throughout the enclosure. So I just went in my backyard and found these. I put them in the autoclave to sterilize them and put them in the enclosure. And I put these in here because corn snakes like to also climb, so this gives lots of climbing opportunities and allows the corn snake to be able to move vertically and horizontally throughout the enclosure. So corn snakes are carnivores, and in the wild they normally eat a variety of organisms including lizards, frogs, mice, rats, and birds. In human care, though, their diet mainly consists of rodents, but they can receive other things. For a juvenile corn snake, they are growing, so the size of their prey item will depend on how large that individual is. As a general rule, though, you don't want their prey item to be more than 1.5 times the widest part of the snake. As they are growing, they want to be fed pretty often, so a good feeding schedule for a juvenile is every 7 to 14 days. They don't have the metabolism of a neonate anymore, so they don't have to be fed twice a week, but they also don't have the metabolism of an adult yet because they are still growing. For water, they need water. They don't have a lot of humidity, so they don't need a large water dish, but water should be provided. So for heat, corn snakes need a basking spot of around 90 degrees. So right here where the arrow is, that is going to be the basking area. So I provided a shelf for the snake, and that way if they want to bask in the heat, they can. There's also that shelf also allows for a hide underneath, so they can still get warm on that side of the enclosure without being in the direct heat source. So they can really thermoregulate throughout this enclosure. So for seasonal cycling, corn snakes during the summer, they need a temperature of 90 degrees, and their ambient temperatures throughout the enclosure should be around 78 to 82 degrees. During the winter time, though, they can actually be cooled down all the way to 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 months to replicate their natural brumation cycles. And normally during brumation times, their feeding will be stopped because they can no longer process their food as they are cold-blooded animals. So for captive breeding in corn snakes, seasonal cycling is very important to help prepare them for breeding. So they will go through a brumation period, which normally occurs during November or December in the cooler months and will last for about 3 months. After this brumation period, you can increase the temperatures of the enclosure back up to their normal maintenance temperatures. Once they're warmed up around March, their feeding should resume, but their diet should be twice as much as their normal diet. This is really important, especially for females, because the females need to have, one, a lot of energy to be able to mate during the breeding season, and also they need to have lots of fat stores so that they can give those to their eggs if they become gravid. The breeding season for corn snakes normally occurs around March and May, and if a female does become gravid, she will then lay her eggs around May and July. So incubation for corn snake eggs normally occurs for 60 to 65 days, and they should be kept at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't need a lot of humidity when they're being incubated, so it's important not to drown them in water. They need to have a lot of aeration, and they should be checked daily. So husbandry of neonates, juvenile, and adult corn snakes are very similar, but they do have some differences. In neonates, once they've hatched, you want to separate them from the rest of the clutch and keep them in around an 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Once they hatch, they'll go through a shed, and after that first shed, you want to make sure that they don't have their yolk bulge anymore in their stomach, and when that's no longer visible, they can then be fed an extra small pinky. Normally, they don't need to be scented, but if you have a picky eater, maybe it needs to be scented with some frog juice or gecko juice, as they do eat other organisms in the wild. And as they are small, you do want to feed them quite often, so a good feeding regimen for neonate snakes is about twice a week, and water should always be available. And as a neonate, they are small, so you don't want to keep a tiny, tiny snake in a giant enclosure because it's hard to keep track of that snake, and as you're trying to make sure that it's growing and it's eating, you want to be able to easily see that snake. So you can house them in a small tank or in a rack system. Either is good. So for juveniles, they are growing, so they do need to be eating often, but not as often as neonates. So a good feeding regimen, as stated earlier, is 7 to 14 days. And since they are growing, there is no set food size for them, so it really just depends on the size of the snake at the time, and that food prey item should never be larger than 1.5 times the width of the individual. In juveniles, since they aren't as big as adults, they also can be housed in tanks or rack systems, but they definitely need a bigger enclosure than a neonate. You want to make sure that they're able to completely spread out. You don't want them to feel crammed or very confined. And for adults, it's preferable to keep them in either a large tank or a large PVC enclosure that's at least the length of the snake. You want to make sure that they're able to completely stretch out and give them that ability. And again, normally adult corn snakes will eat around a size of a large mouse, but they can also be fed a lot of different things. They can eat frogs and geckos, or even quail. People have fed them quail eggs. It really just depends on what you want. Give them a very diverse diet. And then also, these guys can be fed every 7 to 14 days, but really you need to make sure you're monitoring the body and the weight of the snake, because it's very easy to overfeed adult corn snake and they can become obese. So it's really important that you're feeding based off the size of the snake, and not just off of a set regimen every single week. And it's also really important that adults go through a cycling process. Like neonates and juveniles necessarily don't need to go through this because they're not growing, but in the wild, adults will go through this every year. And it's really healthy for them to go through this cycle, even if they're not going to be bred. But you should still go through temperature changes as they would in the wild. Thank you for listening to my presentation.